What if Jeff Bezos bought the Philippines? Well, that clearly isn't happening as the world's richest man is more interested in colonizing the moon. But there was a moment in history when a crazy rich American offered to buy the Philippines' freedom for $20 million. That man was Andrew Carnegie, the American steel zillionaire who, ironically, hated American imperialism. In this episode, we go back to the time when Carnegie protested against his own country to try and buy the Filipinos their freedom. Buckle up, this is way back when. The year is 1898. The stage, Cuba in the Caribbean all the way to the Philippines in the Pacific. On one side was the once massive Spanish Empire, on the other, the up-and-coming Americans. Both declared war on each other and neither had allies. The Spanish-American War began after a US Navy ship mysteriously exploded in the Havana harbor in Cuba, which was then fighting for independence from Spain. The Spanish Empire faced the Americans on all sides of their empire, but in the end, they lost, giving up control of Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the Americans in the 1898 Treaty of Paris. In the treaty, the US paid $20 million for the Philippines, which would be roughly $650 million today. And while they originally involved themselves in this war against Spain for humanitarian reasons to free Cuba and the Philippines, it was, politely put, a bunch of bullshit. Some politicians cheered the expansion of the US in the Pacific, but many influential Americans opposed it. One player in the opposition, Mark Twain, the father of American literature and the author of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Talk about the pen being mightier than the sword. Huck's author fought American imperialism through the press. He once said, "It should, it seems to me, be our pleasure and duty to make those people free. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." Another American involved in the matter? America's richest man at the time, Andrew Carnegie. While we think of Superman as the man of steel, Andrew Carnegie was the original, owning most of America's railroads and bridges. He was so opposed to America's involvement that he called out the state, tried to speak to McKinley, and offered to pay the Philippine government $20 million so they could buy back their independence from American rule. $20 million was hardly a dent in his pocket, as Carnegie would be worth in today's money about $310 billion. Carnegie's words were a little more passive-aggressive than Twain's. He said, "You seem to have about finished your work of civilizing the Filipino. It is thought that about 8,000 of them have been completely civilized and sent to heaven. I hope you like it." You'd think Congress would listen to the father of American literature and America's richest man at the time, but alas, they did not. Nothing came of the offer. It was ignored by the American Congress, and so the Philippines fought another bloody war, this time against the so-called savior Americans. Naturally, we didn't take kindly to being colonized. Again. But why did Andrew Carnegie even care about Filipinos? He had no direct connection to the country and wouldn't have made any money off buying their freedom. But it all came down to a central belief that Carnegie held, that empires are bad. Call him an idealist, but Carnegie was a fierce anti-imperialist who viewed empires as an obstruction to peace, freedom, and democracy. But sadly, the US government in 1898 didn't see it that way and stayed in the Philippines until 1946. Of course, Carnegie was no hero despite his noble intentions. History remembers him as a man of paradoxes. He was a harsh employer but a generous philanthropist. He was good at making money but gave it all away before he died on August 11, 1919. He donated more than $300 million to causes he believed in, the most important being world peace. Maybe he didn't donate enough? This led to the construction of the Peace Palace at The Hague, which now houses the International Court of Justice. Think lawmakers in the UN. Carnegie's donations also built the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Institution at Washington, D.C., and the New York City concert venue Carnegie Hall. Think the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Carnegie's offer to buy our independence is still a big what if in Philippine history. What if Carnegie purchased the Philippines' independence? What if the Philippines never had an American past? And who would we be if we gained independence at the start instead of the middle of the 20th century? It's another alternate history we can only imagine. But thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Way Back When.